This video is about the economic definition of boundaries. And when I say boundaries here, I'm talking about the version of boundaries that Townsend and Cloud talk about in their book, that Brene Brown talks about in some of her talks and in her book. And so it's something that would not normally be associated with economics, but I think there's a connection. And specifically, I'm going to define a boundary as a budget for emotional and spiritual energy. So first I'm going to define a boundary according to those authors, and then I'm going to make a case that the economic way of looking at this is actually really helpful. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the idea of inventory, where taking an inventory of your strengths, your weaknesses, your character, your sort of what you have to work with is going to be essential if you're going to have a good budget. And I'll relate that to the inventory that you sometimes see in 12-step programs. And finally, I'd like to connect this with some various mantras. So this boundary book by Townsend and Cloud is sort of a classic on the matter, and they define boundary as the property lines that you're maintaining, where you're responsible for everything in the property lines and everything outside of the property lines is not your responsibility. And so the key here is that you get to set your rules for your property. If you say nobody gets to smoke in my house, then you can enforce that rule. And enforcing that rule keeps behaviors out that are sucking up energy. And so the key here is that the boundary is not a wall. It's not for keeping people out. Rather, it's really about if you enter onto my property in a relationship, then you have to follow my rules. And I don't want to be like a dictator on my property. I want to be flexible enough so that different types of people can be comfortable on my property, but you do have to follow the rules I've set up. And I'm being careful about setting those rules so that those rules align with my values and protect my emotional and spiritual energy. So one example here might be you can't just come in anytime you need to talk and assume that I will drop everything I'm doing and attend to your needs. And if someone's doing that, they're sort of using up your energy for their purposes. And maybe you want to give your energy for their purposes many times because you're in a relationship and you care about them, but they're not the only person in your life and you have other valuable things that you do with your time. So if you're going to give your time to them, it's going to be in balance with the other priorities. So one type of boundary relating to that might be, if you're going to ask for my time, I need a day's notice and I reserve the right to say yes or no or reschedule according to my priorities so that the relationship's balanced, so that you're not just giving to anybody who will come in and take from your emotional and relational energy. Now, let me relate that definition to the economic definition of boundaries. So let's look at the budget analogy and how it relates to that concept. When you have a budget, you sit down and you're intentional about aligning the way you spend your money with your values and your priorities. So you might recognize, oh, I'm spending way too much money on coffee, I'm spending way too much money on things that are not valuable, and then at the end of the day, I'm left without enough money for things I really value, like having a vacation with family or going out with friends. So by spending the time to sit down and make up a budget that aligns your values with where your money is going, you are setting up rules for yourself about how to manage that scarce resource, which is money. And so by setting the budget, you're actually also deciding to say no to a lot of things. And that means you're gonna have to go out and enforce the rules you've set for yourself about how you're gonna spend your money. And you're gonna mess up sometimes. You're not gonna always spend perfectly according to the way you've set up your budget. But if you don't align your money with your budget, it's sort of a free-for-all and your money's gonna go to things that actually should be less valuable, but are determined more by external factors outside of yourself. And so boundaries are really about setting the budget for your emotional energy. What kinds of things are sucking up a lot of energy without bringing a lot of value for you? What kinds of things are really energy giving that you don't have the energy or time for because you've spent so much energy or time on those other things? And there are some people that come in and suck up a lot of your emotional energy dealing with their drama, dealing with the ways that they assume they have the right to your emotional energy all the time. And you may need to say no to some of those things. You may need to build up your no muscle in order to cut some of that out of your life so that you have more emotional energy to put towards the things that grow you as a person, that you feel are meaningful, that you've weighed against the more toxic people, and you've sort of said, okay, I'm not cutting this person out of my life. I still care about them, but I need to limit the ways that they come in and take from my life so that I can invest in these other things and these other people that I'm under-investing in, perhaps because these other people just don't approach me with the same entitled attitude where they feel entitled to my emotional engagement. You can see this budget analogy actually works pretty well. Let's compare that with Brene Brown's definition of a boundary, which is a boundary is being really clear about what is okay and what is not okay. And her boundary definition very much matches the other boundary definition. It's really about what are the rules that I need to be clear with people about what kinds of things I will not tolerate in a relationship and what kinds of things I will tolerate. Now, again, you can't be a dictator with your boundaries. You can't enforce tons of things on people because people are complex, and oftentimes there does need to be a negotiation between people about what's okay and what's not okay. But that negotiation, if it's going to happen, needs to be intentional. It needs to be the two people sitting down and figuring out something that works for both of them rather than unintentional or just sort of going with the flow and not being clear about the kinds of interactions that are sucking energy from you. Sometimes people will think boundaries are about getting out of relationship, which would be more of the wall definition of boundaries, but the reverse is actually true. It's about staying in relationship. So how exactly is this about staying in relationship rather than getting out of relationship? Oftentimes what happens in relationships is someone is totally sucking energy from you and they're just draining you, and at some point you just can't handle that person anymore. So you cut them out of your life. That's a pattern that we see. And it's a pattern where that person has never negotiated their needs with that person. They've never set boundaries against behaviors that they don't have the emotional energy to deal with long term. So not setting boundaries is going to lead to more breaks in relationship. If instead of doing that, you do this budget for your emotional and spiritual energy, aligning it with your values and recognize, you know what, this person is draining me. Sometimes the right solution there is to cut that person out of your life. That can be the way things need to go. But honestly, a more fair way of doing that would be to say, you know what, there's things I value about that person, there's things I appreciate about them. I would like to keep those good parts of the relationship going, but these other toxic behaviors are wearing me down in a way that is not sustainable. In which case, you can sort of be clear, these behaviors are not okay. And of course, I won't go into this in this video, but when you set boundaries, you do need ways of not just saying no to the behavior, but if the behavior continues, you need to have a backup plan for how to protect yourself. It's like, I would prefer this relationship to continue and to continue without some of these behaviors that are not okay in the long run. That's the preference. But that person has free will, and boundaries absolutely protect their free will to behave how they want. So it's really about, in order to protect myself and my energy, if those behaviors are happening, if those continue, I'm gonna need to get out of the relationship, or I'm gonna need to put limits on my time with you or the way I respond to you in order to protect myself. It's not about enforcing their behavior, it's about figuring out what you need to do to protect yourself. And that's a lot like a budget, because budgets, of course, require you enacting them by saying no to certain types of spending. The only thing that makes this a lot more difficult is, instead of the other thing that you have to say no to being like stuff that you're buying, it's people. It's people who have their own desires, their own motives, their own free will. And you have to be a little bit more careful about protecting that free will as you enact these boundaries and figure out, this is just what I'm doing to protect myself. Now, real monetary budgets actually do require negotiating with people, because oftentimes some of the spending that is not helpful in your life is spending on people you care about, on things that have some value and have people attached to them. And so carrying out your budget does require some negotiation with people. Hey, I realize this is really important to you, but my finances need some improvement, so this is what I'm doing. And so there is a boundary negotiation with any budget. It's just a little bit less intense relationally than setting boundaries for emotional and spiritual energy. And just to remind you, one definition of economics is it's about the allocation of scarce resources. So this fits. This definition does fit within the framework of economics, right? The last analogy that I would like to make is the analogy of inventory. So anyone in a 12-step program is going to take inventory of their character strengths and their character flaws. And that is because if you're gonna do a budget for your emotional and spiritual energy, you need to know both of those things. You need to know, where do I tend to mess up and where do I really thrive? And personal growth is going to involve both. If there are areas where you tend to mess up, where your weaknesses come out, thinking carefully about boundaries that you can place for yourself to protect yourself from those weaknesses, to protect those around you from those weaknesses, that's really important. But the character strengths are also important. For example, if you're going to do a good job of investing your spiritual energy and your emotional energy, you need to know where you thrive. You need to expand the spaces where those strengths shine. And of course, every person's inventory is going to be completely different, which makes it really hard to judge other people accurately, because it's like, if you're going to judge someone, you would need to have a good understanding of their inventory. What do they have to work with? And people tend to judge other people based on their own inventory. That would be like McDonald's judging Macy's as if Macy's had the same inventory as McDonald's. There's somebody behind the scenes that's sort of setting the budgets for those companies. And of course, how they use those budgets, how they manage the companies, are going to be really intimately tied in with what is in their inventory. And that may include how their inventory should change based on their value. Maybe you as a company need to get rid of some restaurants. Maybe you need to get rid of some items on your menu because keeping those inventories is too burdensome. So inventory itself is dynamic, and you can of course develop abilities that you don't currently have that would later then go into your inventory. That's actually fantastic. But you kind of have to sort of take stock of your inventory as it is before you figure out, where do I need to grow? Where do I need to expand? Which things in my inventory are no longer serving me? All that stuff. So if we're thinking analogies here, really there is the values that you're trying to enact. And of course, with companies, that's profit maximizing, or perhaps the mission statement of the company. But for you, you can have as many values as you want. You might need to prioritize those values, but it's all in your hands. Then you have an inventory, and then you have the budget. And then you have the moments when you're actually enacting the budget, doing the hard work of saying no and yes and rearranging. All of that stuff has a really clear analogy in the boundaries world. And that's just what I'm trying to point out here. One thing you'll hear in 12-step communities is act on the world rather than react to it. And that is so powerful if you try to enact that in your life. Like, what you'll realize is a lot of the ways you're spending your energy are just reacting to things that other people and other institutions and other things are trying to get from you. And that can wear down your spirit. And so how do you act on the world rather than react to it? You may need to sort of take an inventory of your life and the way you're using your energy and resources, and sort of better align the way you're living your life with your values. I mean, by doing that, it gives you this energy. Like, when you get to decide the things you're doing rather than letting other people decide those for you, that like multiplies the energy you have to give. It really does. There's something about that that is just true. Well, and the other mantra or passage that I'd like to connect this with is, above all else, guard your heart. A leader at my church once gave this passage to me as part of my calling. And when she did that, I knew at the time that I didn't fully understand what that meant. But part of living out, well, faith is to say, you know what, people have used this for many years and I don't understand it right now, but if I take it into my life and if I try to enact it in my life, I'm willing to hold on to the possibility that it has a deeper meaning than I know right now. And so I've held that passage for the years. And I think when I've been thinking about boundaries lately, I've come to the realization that guarding your heart means protecting the spiritual and emotional energy so that I'm acting out of my own agency, so that I'm acting out of my spirit rather than letting other people's priorities hijack that. One other mantra that I connect with this is, if you can't say no, you can't say yes. If someone has a gun to your head and they ask you to do something, even if you would have done that on your own, even if you very much agree with what they're asking you to do, you're doing it because of the gun. You're not doing it from a place of your own values. And I think doing things under force or under manipulation, there's some way that eats up the agency that we have to act out of our own values. So I'd also like to connect this with behavioral economics. One of the fun models in behavioral economics is this principal agent model. And behavioral economics applies that to the planner self and the doer self, where the planner self sits down in a moment of quiet where you can actually reflect and think clearly, and the planner self sort of sets the budget, aligns your priorities, and sort of sets up your life so that the doer self can actually enact your values. Now, the doer self is going to have all of these things that make it really hard to enact your values. Like the doer self has moods, the doer self gets emotional, the doer self gets tired. The doer self has some real limits. But the planner self is able to look at that doer self and say, okay, I can see some of the limits. I see why it's hard to actually enact my values. Here are some things that'll help. And one of the things that helps is just having the budget, just having the emotional budget where you can think clearly and prioritize. So maybe the doer self will remember that budget when they're actually out there acting in the world. So the planner doer self, I think, is super related to boundaries. So I hope you found this helpful in thinking about boundaries from an economic perspective.